trains and railroads have always carried with them a certain spectral mystique. For as long as the steel lines have cut across the countryside, stories have followed. Phantom locomotives thundering through the night, ghostly figures swinging lanterns along forgotten tracks, or distant whistles echoing from nowhere. It should come as no surprise that these tales of the uncanny have found a new home in the digital age, threading their way through the shadowed corners of the internet. On Reddit in particular, users have shared countless eerie encounters, transforming the platform into a modern archive of railroad hauntings and unexplained phenomena. In one subreddit, a user shared such a story. In the post, Op stated that when they were around 10 or 11, their family lived far out in the country of the Texas Panhandle. According to them, the area was sparsely populated, with less than 200 people residing there. At one time, a train had run through the countryside, but that had been a long time ago. Even the tracks had long been removed, with only the bare swath of flatness reminding of what once was there. It was this flat path that Op and his friend used to ride their bikes to the fishing creek located several miles on down. One day, while walking with their bikes on the return home, Op and his friend heard what they thought was the sound of a train whistle. But the closest train tracks being used at the time were at least 50 miles away. And, to top it off, it didn't really sound like the whistle of a modern train. Instead, they couldn't help but notice that it had more of an old-timey nature about it. The two continued to walk their bikes, trying to ignore what they had heard. But, in a few moments, they heard the sound again, prompting the duo to push their bikes faster down the path. A short time later, they heard the blare of the whistle for a third time. Only now, it was accompanied with the well-known chugga-chugga of a train. Pushing their bikes to the side, the two transitioned into a full run, doing their best to get away from the apparent train bearing down on them. At what sounded like were surely their final moments, the friends jumped away from the old track. As they did, they could feel the swoosh of a train passing by, though there remained nothing in sight. The two ran away as fast as they could, leaving their bikes behind. Op mentioned that though they later got in trouble for losing their bikes and for creating such a wild story as an excuse, they did not waver, for they knew what they had experienced. On that day, they were certain that what had passed their path had been nothing less than a ghost train. On the same post, a different Redditor commented how they and their fiancé had once lived with some relatives in Oklahoma. The property they lived in was huge, and with it being over 100 years old, it had quite a bit of history tied to it. At one time, it had been a YMCA, and before that, a casket factory. According to Op, you could see where the old tracks had once run through a part of the building. In addition to the old rail, there were also active tracks still located directly behind the structure. On one particular night, Op and their fiancé were on the property alone. With their dog needing to go outside, the couple had decided to bring him out together. It was then that they heard the unquestionable sounds of an oncoming train. As the sounds got closer and louder, their dog ran away back to the building. But the couple stayed, trying their best to see the train they undoubtedly heard. With the area being so open, this shouldn't have been a difficult task, but neither could see a train that would be making the sound. In a few minutes, though, this quickly changed in the most chilling way. Instead of an actual train, the two witnessed just the shadow of one moving in front of a separate outbuilding. No tracks remained here, with the only active track sitting behind this outbuilding and in front of the one in which they lived. This absolutely terrified the couple, as not only should they not have been able to see any active train pass in front of that outbuilding, but what they saw moved along the old rail that still remained there. Without any plausible explanation to be had, the two were rightfully terrified. In a separate subreddit dedicated for train crews to swap stories from the tracks, one post stands apart for its sheer strangeness. In it, the user shared a night that has haunted them ever since. A night in the New Mexico desert where something impossible happened. Up stated that he was part of a crew piloting a stacked train through a vast stretch of desert. As they approached to meet, they dimmed the headlights, a routine courtesy between trains. But just as the lights dropped, movement flickered on the tracks ahead. To Op, it looked like human-shaped shadows poised between the rails at a well-worn foot crossing. It was then that they told the engineer to hit the lights. In the glare that followed, for children appeared, no more than a car length away, frozen in the beam. 3 of them bolted into the dark. The 4th stood still, facing the onrushing engine. A small red bicycle gleamed beside him. The boy didn't move. Traveling 70 miles per hour, the train was upon him in seconds. Op had pushed the brake, plugged it, as railroaders say, and braced for impact. There should have been a sound, a shudder, the terrible noise no engineer ever forgets. Instead, there was nothing. When the train finally stopped, 3,000 feet later, both men sat in stunned silence. Each had seen the same thing. Each knew the boy couldn't have vanished. Local police arrived. Op refused the offered ride in the squad car and began checking the train himself. The consist was intact and the air system was stable. Then a signal maintainer rolled up in his truck, asking where exactly the encounter had happened. The Redditor pointed out the spot, which was by an overpass and an intermediate signal. Minutes later, the signalman called back with grim news. He'd found a body, but not where the children had appeared. Instead, it was half a mile behind them, already cold and most likely a victim of an earlier accident. When the inspection was over, the officer on scene offered a chilling explanation. The children, he said, matched the description of a fatal accident from the 1980s. A group of kids had been killed on those very tracks. One of them had died while on a red bicycle. Shaking his head, the officer then told them how every so often they are called out to the same place, with witnesses echoing what the user had seen. It became apparent to Op that despite other train fatalities happening in the area, it was this spot that blurred the lines between the living and the dead. As if the previous stories aren't spooky enough, another Redditor shared their own unexplained event in yet a different subreddit. In the post, the user stated that at the time they were living in Groton, New York, a place where the railroad tracks went silent many years prior. According to them, the Southern Central Railroad, which was later part of the Lehigh Valley Line, was abandoned in 1978. Since that time, the rails had been slowly reclaimed by weeds and memory. But on one quiet night decades later, something strange stirred along the forgotten right-of-way. Op recalled the moment vividly. He commented that it had begun innocently enough, with a late-night message from a neighbor across the street. In the message, the neighbor asked Op to come outside. He hesitated, not wanting to be bothered, but then decided to go outside to meet his friend in the dark. Outside, his friend was waiting in the middle of the road, listening intently. At first, Op thought it was a prank, as they didn't know what their friend was doing. But then the sound came, a low, resonant horn rising from the valley below. It was the unmistakable cry of a train, long and distant, though no train had passed through Groton in 30 years. The two stood frozen as the sound hung in the air, steady and unmoving. It wasn't the Doppler-shifting blare of a car or truck, but something fixed in place, something that didn't belong. Driven by a mix of fear and fascination, they ran toward an old crossing on Walpole Road, hoping to find a source. When they arrived, the night was still. A nearby porch light glowed, and 2 men stood outside. When asked, both of the men they encountered confirmed they'd heard it too. One of them even commented exactly what Op was thinking, that they must have heard a ghost train. This alignment of thought only served to freak out Op more, as he had not expected someone else to echo his suspicions. For Op, the experience remains unsolved. He calls it puzzling but incredible, a memory that refuses to fade. In Groton, the rails may have gone quiet, but sometimes, it seems, the past still rolls through. In the same thread, another user responded that they had not one, but 2 ghost stories to share. As if to distance the reality of what had happened, the user first pointed out that it was possible they had just been fatigued. However, it was evident that the experiences had an impact on the user, and with much indulgence, they continued on with their frightening tales. The first started late one night, when Op had been running east through Metawan. The Redditor remarked how the rails were clear, the signal lights green, and the dark silhouette of an abandoned glass factory loomed off to the north. The plant was half demolished, its remaining wall skeletal against the sky. The train had just accelerated to 70 miles per hour when something moved in the shadows near the factory. What emerged from the darkness was enormous. Opp later described it as a huge, black creature, something like a Great Dane, charging straight toward the train. In an instant, it leapt across both sets of mainline tracks in a single bound. There was no impact, no sound, nothing to suggest it hadn't cleared the rails. They blew the horn for the next crossing and rolled on. But then they heard it. Heavy, rapid footfalls on the ballast outside the window, keeping pace with the train. When they looked in the mirror, they saw it again. The creature, whatever it was running alongside the locomotive, matching its 70-mile-per-hour speed with impossible ease. It stayed with the train for nearly a mile and a half, vanishing only when the line curved toward the marshland near the bridge. The creature had vanished as quickly as it came. But even after it was gone, Opp couldn't reconcile what he'd seen. After all, nothing alive could run that fast through grass and water. Perhaps another experience would give them more insight, but the creature was never to be seen again. Months later, on a different night along the northeast corridor between Brunswick and Princeton, Opp witnessed something even stranger. They were running at full speed, just over 100 miles per hour, when a figure appeared in the beam of his headlight. A woman, pale and indistinct, seemed to materialize on the tracks ahead, but she wasn't stationary. For a moment, it looked as though she was moving with the train, gliding in the light as if she were suspended in air. For almost a minute, she remained there, facing away from Opp, her form faint and shimmering like a hologram. Then, as they tapped the horn, the figure slowly turned. She reacted in horror, arms rising as though bracing for impact. In that instant, she became still, frozen on the track, and the train overtook her. There was no sound, no thump, no sign of collision. Opp brought the train to an emergency stop and inspected the front end, but found nothing. No debris, no evidence of a strike. The next day they were admittedly shaken and took the day off. Later, they learned that there had been a fatal accident on that section of track years before. They couldn't say for certain what they'd seen, but the image of that woman never left them. And yet, the stories of phantom trains don't end with the rails. Hundreds of miles away in Arizona, another Reddit recounted their own strange experience. Not on a train, but behind the front desk of a hotel built on its ghostly remains. The hotel sat in a semi-tourist town with Old West roots, the kind of place where weathered saloons stood beside chain restaurants. New and modern, this particular hotel possessed no historic charm, so it was not the kind of place that attracted ghost hunters or thrill seekers. But it did have a reputation for something inexplicable. According to Opp, guests would often come down in the morning complaining that a train had woken them during the night. The first few times this happened, the Redditor was baffled. There were no active rail lines anywhere nearby. The nearest tracks were, in fact, 50 miles away. After several more reports, curiosity took over. A little research revealed that the hotel stood directly on the site of a long-vanished rail line. 2 buildings over, there had once been a busy depot. The old rail bridge still stood less than a quarter-mile away, its span empty but intact. The tracks had been pulled up half a century earlier, yet guests continued to hear them. Over the course of a year, at least 8 guests reported the same phantom train noises. Horns, wheels, the rhythmic clatter of something that wasn't there. Other staff members had similar stories. Eventually, when guests came down to complain, Opp began sharing the location's history instead of apologizing. The reaction was always the same: surprise, followed by fascination. What had been a nightly nuisance became a talking point, a story guests would retell after checkout. The old depot, now an office building, still bore a plaque describing its past. Opp would point it out with a half-smile, letting guests draw their own conclusions. No one could explain what they were hearing, but in that patch of Arizona desert, where the rails once carved their way toward Phoenix, the echo of a vanished line still seemed to pass through on sleepless nights. A similar story involving a ghost train was shared by a user in a different subreddit. The poster, who was around 8 to 10 years old when it happened, was living in Georgia near a town named Buford. Their mom was employed at a carpet company which had a store at the front of the building and a warehouse in the back. The warehouse was quite large, with a wide variety of flooring stored in it. Outside, there was a concrete loading lot located just past the building's enormous bay doors. That lot in turn sat against an unkempt wooded area, which despite being a bit untamed, was still clear enough to see the backs of a few nearby houses. The building had always given them the creeps. It was a cavernous old warehouse filled with massive hanging carpets that swayed slightly when anyone walked by, the air thick with the scent of fabric dye and dust. While their mother worked up front, they would spend the hours darting between the carpets, pretending the spaces between them were secret corridors. One afternoon, while waiting for their mother to finish her shift, the great bay doors at the back of the warehouse stood open, letting in the blinding summer light. Drawn by the open air, Op wandered out into the loading lot to play. A few minutes passed before the sound reached them, a low, rhythmic rumble that grew steadily louder. To Op, it could only mean one thing. A train was coming. Delighted, they had sprinted to the edge of the lot, shielding their eyes from the glare as sunlight flashed against something metallic beyond the building. From the right came the deep, resonant call of a train horn, and a moment later the machine itself appeared with silver, as well as a blue the shade of a robin's egg. And with that striking brilliance of color, the train glided along the tracks with the shimmer of polished steel. For Op, every detail etched itself into memory. The cars were close-coupled and sleek, their sides patterned with neat rows of rivets that caught the light. The windows slid downward, revealing a glimpse of passengers dressed in fashions belonging to another age. Women wore rounded hats, a boy darted through the aisle, and a man sat calmly with a pipe, its smoke coiling in the bright afternoon sun. The locomotive's front curved gently into a rounded nose, its body marked with slender blue stripes beneath the windows. It wasn't a long train, but it seemed impossibly elegant, an artifact from another time gliding effortlessly through the present. Transfixed, Op watched until the horn faded and the last car disappeared beyond the bend. A moment later, their mother emerged from the warehouse, ready to leave. Op, breathless with excitement, tried to explain what had just passed, but their mom's expression shifted from confusion to quiet disbelief. There were no trains behind the building. The tracks, she insisted, ended just beyond view. Still unconvinced, Op ran to see. The rails did, in fact, vanish into weeds and gravel only a short distance away. No fresh impressions, no gleam of metal, no trace of motion lingered there, only the silence of a line that had been dead for years. And yet, the image endured. The glint of sunlight on steel, the boy running down the aisle, the wisp of pipe smoke drifting in the light. What faded were the faces, which grew hazy with time, leaving behind only gestures and silhouettes, preserved like fragments of a dream. They never saw the train again, but long after the warehouse closed and the carpet stopped swaying in the heat, the memory of that phantom locomotive remained, bright, impossible, and as real as the dust rising beneath their feet. These stories, along with many others, persist despite going against the realms of possibility. For reasons that defy explanation, trains and railways have long seemed to attract more than mere travelers. Along their iron paths, stories persist of phantom engines thundering through the dark, of spectral passengers glimpsed in passing windows, of unseen forces haunting the rails themselves. Through the shared accounts of those who have witnessed the inexplicable, we gain fleeting insight into a realm just beyond our grasp, a place where memory, machinery, and mystery converge. So perhaps, the next time you pause beside a crossing or hear the faint echo of a distant whistle, listen closely. You might just catch a sound that doesn't belong to this world.